Welcome to Chapter 2. We're going to take a look at an overview of the chapter, which looks at the nature and extent of juvenile delinquency. And so really understanding how experts gather information on delinquency is really the central focus of the first part of the chapter. I don't even know if you know how this information is gathered. Well, there are three primary sources of data: official records, victim surveys, and self-report surveys. So one of the key components of official records is the Uniform Crime Report, which is compiled by the FBI. Now, what they compile information on is crimes such as homicide, forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, arson, and motor vehicle theft. And these are called Part 1 offenses. Now, they also compile information on other offenses that are known as Part 2 offenses. And Part 2 offenses include things such as drug crimes, status offenses, and other crimes. Now, one of the problems with using official data or official arrest data is that they only count those people that have been caught. And there can also be problems with local law enforcement agencies that may intentionally or unintentionally make reporting errors. Now, when we say intentionally, they may not want it to appear that they have a high crime rate in the area, so they may underreport. And then unintentionally just means human error. Now, there's also self-report surveys that can measure crime, and they can help us learn how many youths commit crimes but are never arrested. Now, part of the problem, though, with self-report surveys really has to do with one basic question, and that is, do you think that it's reasonable to expect kids to admit illegal acts? And then another thing that's interesting is whether or not kids exaggerate their involvement in illegal acts. And if they would do that, why would they do that? So those are things to consider with self-report surveys. Now, have you ever been the victim, or do you know someone that's been the victim of a crime? Well, the National Crime Victimization Survey indicates that many victims don't report crime. Now, why do you think that there's this discrepancy between crime reports to the police and the findings from the National Crime Victimization Survey exist? Now, maybe some of it is due to embarrassment, or maybe a belief that nothing can be done. Regardless of the exact reason, it's important to remember that victim surveys generally indicate that the crime problem may be a much larger issue than what official arrest data indicate. Now, the second main focus of the chapter is the use of secondary sources of data, and there's all kinds of them. I'm just going to mention a few here, including cohort research data, which involves observing a group of youth that share a similar or like characteristic and measuring that over a period of time. There's also experimental data, which comes from actual experiments that use a random selection of people, a comparison group, and then certain experimental conditions. And then another source involves observational or interview research, where researcher actually observes and interviews criminals that are currently participating in crime, or maybe those that have participated in crime, like interviewing someone in a prison setting. Now, one of the important things to consider about the different methods of gathering data is that each of them have their own benefits, and they add more to the picture of what is actually going on as far as the nature and extent of crime. Now, crime and delinquency rates for juveniles really trended upward from about 1960 till 1991, but have since undergone a very dramatic decline. In fact, in 2009, there were about 10.6 million crimes compared with 14.6 million in 1991. And this decrease of 4 million occurred despite a 50 million person population increase. Now, why do you think that might have occurred? Something for you to think about. Now, this chapter also discusses different correlates of delinquency. Some of the more interesting ones that I think include gender differences, racial differences, and social class differences. So I really want to challenge you, in addition to what the textbook offers, but think of what are some of the reasons that there's these differences amongst those different groups. Now, remember in Chapter 1 we talked about aging out of crime, or the fact that most youth offenders don't continue crime when they become adults. So how can we explain the fact that some people don't age out of crime? Some of them actually commit. Do you think there are certain factors? Do you think there are other factors than what's mentioned in the textbook that lead to chronic offending? If so, what might those factors be? Again, food for thought. Now, the last thing in the chapter talks about juvenile victimization and actually states that juveniles are more likely to be victims of crime than adults are. So also think about, why do you think that is? Why are juveniles at a higher risk for crime? Now next week we'll take a look at Chapter 3, which is going to start exploring some of the reasons that people commit crime by looking at individual views of delinquency.